The Telegraph has taken the decision to publish Matta Hancocka and other ministers and their aides' messages in the lockdown files because we strongly believe it's in the public interest to do so.
Matta Hancocka, done his diaries, totally turned over by Isabel Oakeshott now. Don't you feel a little bit of sympathy for him?
No, I don't.
We did have an unprecedented set of circumstances that faced the government and indeed the country back in March 2020 when this pandemic broke out. And subsequently, there's been a huge amount of scrutiny, not least in this newspaper, of some of the decisions that were taken. And we believe that in the interests of openness, transparency and accountability, the public has a right to know some of the discussions that took place behind the scenes that informed decisions which affected people's lives. I mean, there are some stories in journalism that aren't a matter of life and death, but this one was. And the decisions that were taken in the first 3 months of the pandemic arguably cost more than 20,000 people in care homes their lives. They cost, you could argue, the educational life chances of a generation of children. And they cost small and medium-sized businesses money on their profit margins that they may never be able to recover from. And not least did it cost the British psyche enormously to be locked down for weeks and months on end and be made to wear masks when there has always been a question mark over whether the science was actually followed. And what we're trying to do with these lockdown files is show that at times this part of the narrative suggests that far from following the science, actually public health policy was made up on the hoof, perhaps out of necessity because of the urgency of the situation, but also perhaps out of a degree of political expediency. Was it right that decisions were made at the last minute on, say, the admission of people into care homes and Mr. Hancocka deciding against Professor Cush-Switty, the Chief Medical Officer's advice, that only those who are coming from hospitals should be tested and that those coming from the wider community shouldn't? Was it right for decisions to be delegated to care homes to decide how they were going to test those coming into from the community, if at all, and how they were going to segregate them? As a newspaper, we will always try and argue that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Mr. Hancocka has argued that this is all going to come out in a public inquiry, in which case you could perhaps counter-argue and say, well, you shouldn't have any problem with your own messages being exposed in this way if you've got nothing to hide at all from the inquiry.
I personally think it's a public service that all this is in the public domain and we can begin to make up our own minds and see.
What the public wants is not an inquiry which only deals with a certain number of pieces of intel and that has to deal with heavily redacted material. We also think that justice delayed is justice denied. And if there are any lessons to be learned, to use the stock phrase from the finding of most government inquiries, is that they take too long to report back to the public. Sir Keir Starmer has said in the House of Commons earlier today at PMQs that surely this investigation makes it far more urgent for there to be a public inquiry. We can't wait years. It's got to provide answers within months. And I think this newspaper would agree with that analysis.
The COVID inquiry has already cost the taxpayer £85 million and hasn't heard from a single government minister yet. So can the Prime Minister assure the House no more delays, that the inquiry will have whatever support it needs to report by the end of this year?
We are publishing these messages because we think that the public has a right to know as much as possible and not for the inquiry to redact or blot out some of the decision-making that took place behind the scenes. You will no doubt have read the piece by Isabel Oakeshott, who is the journalist that obtained Matta Hancocka's messages from WhatsApp, because actually the former Health Secretary gave them to her in full. As we've pointed out in copy, some of the earliest messages had been deleted, but effectively what he handed over were 2.3 million words of his own messages between him, the Prime Minister, other key players, aides, and other health representatives during that unprecedented period. Isabella's justified her own decision-making in the piece that she's written for The Telegraph, speaking about the importance of transparency and accountability. People will make their own minds up as to the wisdom of Mr. Hancock handing these messages to Isabel Oakeshott for the purposes of her to ghostwrite his Pandemic Diaries book. People will also perhaps have questions of the wisdom of Mr. Hancock commercialising the pandemic to sell a book on bookshelves. People watching this will have to understand that we've had a team of reporters working on this not just for weeks but months, and there have been 2.3 million words to trawl through. They've had to be analysed, they've had to be segregated into different topics. The facts around the matters have to be checked and checked again. As you would imagine, we apply proper journalistic scrutiny to all of this material. Therefore, we have to release this investigation in different stages. We took the decision that the care home revelations were most appropriate for the first day of the story, because we know that there were more than 20,000 deaths in care homes in the first 3 months of the pandemic, and that statistic speaks for itself. But as the investigation plays out, you will see some of the decision-making around schooling and the closure of schools, some of the decision-making around face masks and the wearing of face masks, some of the decision-making around the psychological aspect of the government's pandemic handling and how they wanted the public to react. And we will speak to a climate that perhaps is best described as Project Fear. Again, readers will have to decide whether that was necessary because the government was desperately trying to preserve life and ensure that everyone was taking their messages seriously, or whether actually we went too hard, too fast. The messages are going to also, I think, reveal the human side of some of the decision-making, really difficult decision-making for the Prime Minister and the ministers of the day faced with unprecedented circumstances.